They called him Liver-Eating Johnson, and the legend said he earned that name by killing over 300 Crow warriors, cutting out their livers and eating them raw as an act of ultimate revenge. The story goes like this. Crow Indians murdered his pregnant wife, so he declared a one-man war against the entire tribe. For 25 years, he hunted them across the Rocky Mountains, taking their livers to deny them the afterlife their religion promised. It's one of the most brutal revenge stories in American frontier history. A tale of grief, violence, and cannibalism that became a legend of the Wild West. There's just one problem. Almost none of it was true. The real John Liver-Eating Johnson was far stranger than the myth. He was a deserter, a bootlegger, a man who knocked out a naval officer and ran, a mountain man who lived among the very people he was supposedly at war with. And when confronted about the legend in his old age, he laughed it off as complete nonsense. So how did a violent alcoholic drifter become the most famous cannibal mountain man in American history? And what was the truth behind the man who inspired a Hollywood film starring Robert Redford? This is the real story of Liver-Eating Johnson, and it's somehow even wilder than the legend. John Garrison Johnston, who would later change his name to John Johnson to avoid execution, was born on July 1st, 1824, in Little York, New Jersey. His mother was Eliza Garrison. His father was Isaac Garrison, a man of Irish or Scottish descent who worked whatever jobs he could find to keep the family fed. John had 5 sisters and possibly a brother, and his childhood was hell. Isaac Garrison was an alcoholic, a brutal, angry man who drank away whatever money the family had and then worked his son to the bone to pay off his debts. Young John was sent to work as a farm laborer while still a child, hauling, lifting, plowing from dawn until he collapsed from exhaustion. And when he didn't work hard enough, Isaac beat him. This was the 1830s. Child labor was common. Fathers had near absolute authority over their children, and if Isaac Garrison wanted to work his son until he dropped, there was no one to stop him. John grew up learning that the world was violent, cruel, and indifferent to suffering. He learned that survival meant being tougher than everyone around you. And he learned that when someone hurt you, you hurt them back, harder. By his early teens, John had had enough. He ran away from home, a dangerous decision for a boy with no money, no skills, and no connections. But staying would have killed him, so he took his chances. He found work on a coastal whaling schooner. For the next 12 years, John Johnston lived at sea, hauling ropes, gutting whales, sleeping in cramped quarters with dozens of other rough men. It was brutal work, but it was better than his father's farm. By the time he came ashore in 1846, John had grown into a massive man, over 6 feet tall, 260 pounds, nearly all muscle. He had a thick beard, a deep voice, and a reputation for being quick to anger and slow to forgive. He was 22 years old, and the Mexican-American War had just begun. In 1846, John Johnston enlisted in the U.S. Navy. America was at war with Mexico, and young men were signing up in droves. Johnston likely saw it as steady pay, food, and a chance for adventure. But his military career lasted exactly long enough for him to commit a crime that should have gotten him hanged. One day, while on deck, Johnston witnessed a lieutenant punishing one of his fellow sailors. The exact nature of the punishment isn't recorded. Maybe it was a flogging, maybe just harsh words. But whatever it was, it set Johnston off. In a moment of pure impulsive rage, Johnston walked up to the lieutenant and punched him in the neck. The officer went down hard. He was dazed, disoriented, unsure what had just hit him. When he finally got to his feet, he suspected it was Johnston, but he couldn't prove it. Johnston was confined to the ship for a month as punishment. But the moment he was allowed to step onto land again, he deserted, just walked away, vanished into the frontier. Desertion from the Navy during wartime was a capital offense. If caught, Johnston would be executed by hanging. So he did what any smart fugitive would do. He changed his name. John Garrison Johnston became John Johnson, a simple alteration that would make him harder to track. And then he headed west, far west, into the wild, lawless territories where the U.S. government had little reach and a man could disappear. He ended up in California just before the gold rush, working as a miner. Then he drifted east through Colorado, north through Wyoming, and finally settled in the Alder Gulch territory of southern Montana. There, in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, John Johnson became a mountain man. Mountain men were a unique breed in the mid-19th century American West. They were trappers, hunters, guides, men who lived alone or in small groups in the wilderness, far from civilization. They traded furs for supplies. They built cabins in remote valleys. They navigated forests, rivers, and mountain passes that most people would never see. And they were often violent, hard-drinking, and dangerous. John Johnson fit right in. He worked as a woodcutter, supplying cordwood to steamboats traveling the rivers. Thanks to his massive build, he could chop more wood faster than almost anyone else. But he also trapped beaver, hunted elk and bear, and, most profitably, ran an illegal bootlegging operation, selling whiskey to anyone with money. It was during this time that Johnson met his lifelong friend and partner, a man named J.X. Beidler. Both men loved drinking. Both had violent tempers. And both thrived in the chaotic, lawless world of the frontier. Johnson became skilled at surviving in the wilderness. He could track animals for days. He could build shelters, find water, navigate by the stars. He was a crack shot with a rifle and deadly with a knife. But he also spent much of his time fighting. Not hunting, not trapping, fighting. Because the Montana Territory in the 1840s and 1850s was a war zone. White settlers, miners, and trappers were flooding into land that had belonged to indigenous tribes for thousands of years. The U.S. government was pushing Native Americans off their land through treaties, violence, and outright genocide. And men like John Johnson were on the front lines. He fought Sioux warriors who tried to steal his traps. He fought Blackfoot raiders who ambushed his camps. He fought anyone who threatened him or his livelihood. And somewhere in all that violence, a legend was born. Here's the story that made John Johnson famous. While living in Montana, Johnson met a young woman from the Flathead Indian tribe. They fell in love. They married. She became pregnant. Johnson built a log cabin for them in the wilderness, and for a brief time, he was happy. Then, one day in 1847, while Johnson was out hunting, a group of Crow warriors raided his cabin. They killed his pregnant wife. They burned his home to the ground. When Johnson returned and found her body, something inside him snapped. He swore a blood oath. He would hunt down every member of the Crow tribe he could find. He would kill them all. And he would eat their livers. Why their livers? Because in Crow belief, the liver was essential to entering the afterlife. Without it, a person's spirit would wander forever, never finding peace. By eating their livers, Johnson wasn't just killing his enemies. He was damning them for eternity. It was the ultimate act of disrespect. The ultimate revenge. According to the legend, Johnson spent the next 25 years hunting Crow warriors across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. He killed over 300 men. He became so feared that Crow mothers would use his name to frighten children into behaving. The Crow Nation sent their best warriors to kill him. A party of 20 men, the tribe's elite fighters. Johnson killed them all. At one point, he was captured by the Blackfoot tribe, who planned to sell him to the Crow for a reward. But Johnson broke free, killed his guard, and, according to one version of the story, cut off the guard's leg, and ate it while escaping through the wilderness. For 25 years, the legend says, Liver-Eating Johnson was a one-man army of vengeance, unstoppable and merciless. And then, finally, he made peace with the Crow. The frontier wars were escalating. White settlers and native tribes alike were under pressure, and Johnson, now in his late 40s, decided the vendetta had gone on long enough. He shook hands with Crow chiefs. The war was over. It's an incredible story, a tale of love, loss, revenge, and survival that became part of American frontier mythology. There's just one problem. None of it happened. John Johnson never had a wife. He said so himself, multiple times. In his later years, when people asked him about the famous legend, he denied it flatly. He never married a flathead woman. He never lost a pregnant wife. He never waged a 25-year war against the Crow tribe. So where did the story come from? One possibility. Johnson once escorted a Native American woman to a frontier trading post. When they arrived, she claimed they were married, likely to protect him from harassment or to secure safe passage. The rumor spread, and over time, it grew into the legend of his murdered wife. Another possibility. Johnson told the story himself as a joke or a boast, and people took it seriously. Or maybe someone else made it up entirely, and Johnson just never bothered to correct it until later in life. Whatever the origin, the murdered wife revenge story was a myth. And Johnson's relationship with the Crow tribe? Also not what the legend claimed. Johnson's military records make no mention of a personal war against the Crow. In fact, multiple sources suggest he was on good terms with many Crow people. One account even claims he was made an honorary chief of the Crow Nation out of respect for his skills as a hunter and fighter. Yes, Johnson killed Crow warriors. But those killings were in self-defense, during conflicts that involved many people, not a solo vendetta. And the liver eating? That part is partially true, but not the way the legend tells it. So if Johnson didn't spend 25 years eating crow livers in revenge, how did he get the name Liver-Eating Johnson? The real story is far less dramatic, but somehow more disturbing. In the summer of 1868, Johnson was working as a woodcutter on the Musselshell River in Montana. It was dangerous work. 7 other woodcutters had been killed in the area that year, mostly in raids by Sioux warriors defending their territory from white encroachment. One day, Johnson and his crew were ambushed by 6 Sioux men. A gunfight broke out. One of the Sioux warriors was killed. Several men on both sides were wounded. The fight reached a stalemate, both sides pinned down, neither able to advance. And then Johnson did something that would define him forever. He walked out into the open, pulled a small piece of raw liver from his knife, and pretended to eat it in full view of the surviving Sioux fighters. It wasn't a real human liver. It was probably a piece of animal liver he'd been carrying, or possibly just a scrap of meat that looked like liver from a distance. But the Sioux warriors watching from across the battlefield thought it was real. They thought he had just cut the liver out of their dead companion and eaten it in front of them. And that's how he got the name. Liver-Eating Johnson wasn't a man who hunted his enemies for decades and consumed their organs as part of a sacred revenge ritual. He was a man who, in the middle of a gunfight, pulled a sick psychological trick to terrify his opponents. It worked. The story spread. And John Johnson became a legend. After the Musselshell River incident, Johnson's life followed a surprisingly mundane path. He kept working as a woodcutter, trapper, and occasional bootlegger through the 1870s. He drank heavily. Whiskey was his constant companion. He got into fights. He drifted from job to job, never staying in one place for long. When the Civil War broke out, Johnson briefly enlisted in the Union Army. joining the 2nd Colorado Cavalry as a scout. He lasted 5 days before deserting again, spending all his pay on whiskey. Somehow, he was reassigned to another regiment. Whether he talked his way out of punishment or just slipped through bureaucratic cracks is unknown. In October 1864, he fought in the Battle of Westport, where he was shot in the leg and shoulder. He recovered and continued fighting until his discharge in September 1865. After the war, Johnson returned to Montana. He tried running a stagecoach line. He worked as a guide for hunting trips. For a time in the 1880s, he even became a lawman, serving as sheriff in the small towns of Colson and Red Lodge, Montana. The man who had supposedly spent 25 years as a savage killer was now enforcing the law. He even briefly joined a Wild West show, but quit after a short time. Apparently, he hated Buffalo Bill Cody and wasn't satisfied with his pay. By the 1890s, Johnson was in his 70s. He built a cabin in the woods, hoping to live out his days in peace, but his health was failing. His years of hard drinking, hard living, and violence were catching up with him. In December 1899, he was admitted to a veterans hospital in Santa Monica, California. 1 month later, on January 21, 1900, John Liver-Eating Johnson died. He was 75 years old. He was buried in a veterans cemetery in Los Angeles. His funeral was small. Few people attended. The legend had faded. But in 1972, something remarkable happened. In 1958, a writer named Raymond Thorpe published a book called Crow Killer: The Saga of Liver-Eating Johnson. It was based loosely on Johnson's life, but it leaned heavily into the myth rather than the reality. Then, in 1972, Hollywood adapted the book into a film called Jeremiah Johnson, starring Robert Redford. The movie was a hit. It romanticized the mountain man lifestyle, portrayed Johnson as a tragic hero seeking revenge, and cemented his place in American popular culture. Suddenly, people cared about Liver-Eating Johnson again. A group of students in Wyoming launched a campaign to relocate his remains from Los Angeles to Cody, Wyoming, a town just 65 miles from his old cabin in Red Lodge. They argued that Johnson belonged in the mountains he had loved, not in a Los Angeles cemetery. In June 1974, Johnson's body was exhumed and reburied in the old Trail Town Cemetery in Cody, Wyoming. Today, his grave is a tourist attraction. People come to pay their respects to the legendary mountain man who supposedly ate 300 crow livers in the name of revenge. But the real John Johnson, the deserter, the drunk, the man who admitted the whole revenge story was nonsense, is largely forgotten. So what do we do with a story like this? Do we celebrate the legend? The tale of a grieving husband who waged a one-man war against an entire tribe? Or do we tell the truth? That he was a violent, troubled man who lived a hard life and played a cruel psychological trick that became his legacy? Maybe the answer is both. Because Liver-Eating Johnson's story is really about how legends are made. How a moment of cruelty in a forgotten gunfight can become a myth that lasts 150 years. How the truth gets buried under layers of exaggeration, romanticism, and cultural fantasy. The real John Johnson wasn't a hero, but he also wasn't the monster the legend made him out to be. He was just a man trying to survive in a brutal world. And when that world wanted a story bigger than the truth, it created one. If this story fascinated you, please subscribe. Every week, we uncover the truth behind historical legends, separating myth from reality and finding the humanity buried beneath. Leave a comment. Do you think Johnson encouraged the legend about himself, or was he just a victim of frontier mythology? Thank you for watching. And thank you for remembering the real John Johnson, not just the legend.